One of the most common food targets that you'll find for fad diets and quick start weight loss programs is the carbohydrate. Most of us are familiar with the Atkins program and Sugar Busters, and these are carb restrictive programs, with the idea being that carbohydrates are what causes you to retain water, and too many carbs in your diet will add fat to your body. And while this isn't necessarily the case, the people who, Dr. Atkins, for example, made such a great case about it and had such awesome case studies for his low-carb diets that most people jumped on that bandwagon. One thing that folks don't understand, though, is that carbs are your energy food source. Okay, so whenever you want energy, you should have a carbohydrate. A sugar high is a bad example, but it's still an example. If you have an excess of sugar, you get a quick burst of energy. So carbohydrates are our energy food source. Now, that's not to say that carb restrictive diets are horrible and you should never ever do one. While I wouldn't recommend going to the degree that Dr. Atkins would prescribe for you, if an individual is overweight and ready to begin making changes to his or her nutrition, with the help of a professional who's skilled and knowledgeable about nutrition, they may be prescribed a carb restrictive diet for up to 6 weeks. And then they'll go back to a more balanced diet. And then they may go back to the carb restrictive diet. That being said, the key is that it's only for about 4 to 6 weeks. Carb restriction is not a long-term solution. And that was the big problem with Atkins and Sugar Busters. You cannot maintain that lifestyle forever. Yet there was no plan prescribed for afterwards. So with all of and we are steeped in anti-carbohydrate rhetoric and anti-carbohydrate websites, and with all of that negative carbohydrate information floating around, the question is to carb or not to carb. First, I think we need to know more about what is a carbohydrate actually. All of the food that we ingest are molecules, of course. Our body's a biochemical machine, and all of the food we ingest are molecules. Carbohydrates are molecules that are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In fact, if you go do your own nutrition research, in some of the literature, you'll see carbohydrates referred to as capital C, capital H, capital O, CHO. That's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So if you see that acronym in there, that's what it means. It's talking carbs. And now, there is debate, as I said, in all of the literature around fad diets and do this and don't do that diets. How many carbs are we supposed to have in a day? And the answer, according to medical professionals, fitness professionals, and other folks that you should be listening to when you're looking for a new nutrition plan, the answer is actually 45 to 65% of your daily calorie intake should be from carbs. So let's stop and think about that. That probably sounds like a lot of your daily intake based on carbs, especially since, as I've said, everybody says no carbs, no carbs, no carbs. So where do they get that number? Well, as I said, carbohydrates are our energy. Proteins don't really metabolize well into energy. Healthy fats are not really meant to provide energy. Carbohydrates are where we get our energy. So 45 to 65% of your diet should be carbs. Even if you were one of those types of people that like to have everything in perfect balance, I would still recommend that the lowest amount of carbs that you should intake in any day, on a normal day, not whenever you're trying to do a time-limited carb-restrictive diet, but in a normal day, the minimum amount of carbs that you should intake is actually 40%. Don't go below that. Don't go below that, okay? And when I talk about carbs as 40%, these are the healthy carbs. So, we know that carbs provide our energy. We eat the carbs, our bodies store the energy that they provide, and then we use it as needed. So, now that we know why we're having carbs and how many carbs to have, the question is, where do we find these carbs? There are technically good carbs and bad carbs. The good carbs are commonly called in the literature complex carbohydrates, and I'm sure you've heard it. But exactly what is a complex carbohydrate? Well, these carbs are usually high in fiber, they give you a long burst of energy, and they allow energy to be stored. So this includes fresh fruit. And when you're looking at fruit, you want to look for fruit with a low glycemic index, and you can Google which fruit are those, but just to give you an idea, it's raspberries, apricots, strawberries, blackberries, all of the berries. Stay away from oranges and bananas, have a much higher glycemic index, so they wouldn't be considered a complex carb. Complex carbs are also whole grains, which means the entire grain is used, it's not processed, and there's nothing added back to it. Nuts, legumes, and believe it or not, dairy products are considered complex carbs. And by that I don't mean milk flavored with quick. That completely defeats the purpose. I mean milk, fat, or sugar-free yogurt, cheeses, and sour cream. So then when we're talking about the bad carbs, these are simple carbs. So simple means that they have no nutritional value. They're also called empty calories. So those are beer, candies, the milk chocolates, refined grains that you would find in white breads, white rice, and plain white potatoes. And I know some people make the argument that potato skins have they're a good source of iron, and this is true, but I'm not sure that that source of iron is worth the calorie boom that you set off to your diet just by consuming a white potato. So as I said, these are simple carbs, and these carbohydrates will give you a quick burst of energy. It's called a sugar high. But after that sugar high, what always happens? You just feel like sugar high, taper off, and then you crash. And what happens when you crash? Straight back to the kitchen for something else. So that's the pitfall that a lot of Americans actually find themselves in, is that they consume these simple carbohydrates, either by design or just by not paying attention, and then they crash and they go back to the kitchen. And the danger there is you've got this burst of calories, and usually it's a much higher calorie load for these simple carbohydrates than you would have for a great complex carbohydrate. For example, Snicker bar has a lot more calories than a cup of blueberries. Which choice would you really want to make? So you have the Snickers bar, and an hour later you're in the kitchen. You're down 600 calories on your day, and you're going to have some more. It's a vicious cycle, okay? And that's not one we want to engage in. So try to pick off the complex carbohydrates. So I wanted to relay a story to you from my own home with complex carbohydrates. My husband brought home whole grain tortilla chips to have with our salsa. And I was like, awesome, they're whole grain chips, woohoo! And when I actually had one, it tasted just like a deep fried frito. So I asked him, I said, is this a deep fried tortilla chip? And he's like, I don't know, it said whole grain on the bag. It's like, okay, let's read the bag. And if you'd like to see the images that I took from the bag, they'll be on the blog at www.thebizNewsChannel.com for the health kick. And just to tell you what the picture said, it says restaurant-style chips naturally made with whole grains. Sounds good so far. So I looked at the nutrition label, and judging by the nutrition label with a total fat of 7 grams per serving, these are fried chips. So when I look at the ingredients, it's white corn and oil, and that's it. So it's whole grain, white corn, and oil. And there are no artificial flavors or preservatives, but that doesn't change the fact that these are whole grain fried potato chips. And I told you that story so I could caution you. Just because something says whole grain, while it is indeed a better choice, make sure it's not something deep fried. That just killed me. Who fries whole grain chips? So whole grain doesn't necessarily mean super healthy. We've got to be label readers. Definitely read the labels. And that being said, not everything that looks like it's whole grain is actually whole grain. And what whole grain means is that the food contains the entire grain kernel, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm, which is like the nut or the seed. And refined grains, like we find in white bread, have been processed and processed and processed. And oftentimes in the white grain varieties, they have gone back and enriched them with artificial vitamins and minerals. But really, when you can get it directly, naturally from a whole grain product, why not do it that way, right? So when looking at labels and looking for whole grain, keywords that you want to search for are brown rice, bulgur, like bulgur wheat, graham flour, oatmeal, whole grain corn, whole oats, whole rye, whole wheat, wild rice, quinoa, and spelt. I've not seen that one. I keep looking for it though. Just a word of caution, again, please read those labels, read those boxes, and make sure that your product is a whole grain product. Nothing refined, or very little refined, okay? Skip the whole wheat, skip the 7 grains, skip the brand. Look for whole grain varieties. And so today, we asked the question, to carb or not to carb, and I would definitely say carb. Just do it responsibly. Bon appetit!